Wonderful. Thank you, Sarah. Well, as I'm sure is obvious to everybody who's participating in this webinar, the nation's electricity sector is in the midst of a major transition. Natural gas prices are low, and projections suggest that they will remain low for the foreseeable future. Low natural gas prices, in combination with new environmental regulations, have led to the retirement of coal-fired power plants. Low natural gas prices are also putting economic pressure on some nuclear power plants in competitive marketplaces, and that's occurring at the same time that many operators of nuclear power plants are considering whether or not to pursue renewal of their operating licenses. Costs for wind and solar continue to fall. In many parts of the country, it's uncertain what electricity demand growth is going to look like in the future. It could remain relatively flat. It could even potentially go negative in some parts of the country, which raises the risk that overbuilding could result in stranded costs, or underbuilding could impact electricity reliability. And of course, with the Clean Power Plan litigation underway, there's uncertainty regarding the future of CO2 policy. So any of these trends would create challenges for electricity generators and regulators taken together, and the fact that they're occurring at the same time and the pace and scale at which they're occurring are creating broad uncertainty across the electricity sector that has the potential to impact electricity rates, public health, and employment far into the future. If you could go to the next slide, please. So federal policy will shape how the sector responds to these challenges and how the sector evolves over the coming decade. As Sarah referenced when she opened the webinar, each of the speakers here in the webinar have co-authored a report that was released on Monday that explores 6 key issues the next president will face early in his or her administration. The issues are federal regulation of electricity markets, climate policy, nuclear energy, natural gas, economic development, and federal procurement. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, but we do think that these are the issues that are most likely to require decisions in the early days of the next administration. This webinar will summarize the white paper. I want to emphasize that the organizations involved in this effort are all based at universities. Our mission is to bring the resources of academia to bear on major environmental and energy policy challenges of the day. The purpose of this joint effort is to identify the decision points facing the next administration and how existing laws will inform the responses. Neither the paper nor this webinar will advocate a particular policy response. Just a reminder that we will take questions at the end, and with that, let me turn it over to our first presenter, Ari Fusco at Harvard.
Thank you, Jonas. So FERC, or the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, is tasked with regulating markets for wholesale electricity. The real decision point for the next president is the appointment of 2 new FERC commissioners. FERC right now only has 3 commissioners, which means that there are 2 vacancies. This is unusual, but not quite as unprecedented as the Supreme Court only having 8 justices. E&E News recently researched this issue and found that the longest stretch at FERC with just 3 members was from July 2005 to July 2006, so a whole year. FERC has been operating with 4 members for a few months now, and the 4th member just recently retired rather, his term was up. FERC is an independent commission, which is distinct from executive agencies, so the president's key point of influence over the commission is really the appointment of commissioners, and of course those commissioners then have to be approved by the Senate. One interesting aspect of this is that the law specifies that not more than 3 members of the commission shall be members of the same political party, and all 3 current members are Democrats, so the next 2 members cannot be Democrats. So the president's choices on this issue could be very influential in the commission's decisions. Terms are for 5 years, and many recent appointees have actually served 2 terms. So before I mention the specific issues that are on the slide that we highlight in the report, I want to step back and highlight how FERC wields its authority. First, FERC can approve market rules. As the map on page 4 of the report illustrates, most of the eastern half of the country is served by interstate regional markets that are operated by FERC-regulated regional transmission organizations, or RTO, and FERC has to approve any significant rule changes in these markets. Second, FERC can initiate its own reforms of market rules, and the recent Supreme Court case about demand response is an example of this. Relatedly, FERC also responds to complaints about market rules filed by market participants, and it also responds to petitions for declaratory relief, which may request that FERC declare a certain policy is preempted by federal law. FERC has less influence over utilities that do not participate in organized wholesale markets, which is primarily in the Southeast and most of the West. But FERC does administer PURPA, which I'll talk about in a minute, and FERC has in the past required all utilities to reform transmission tariffs. So, for example, it's done this to change some technical rules that better facilitate renewable energy. So let me turn to the 4 decision points on the slide. The first one is about the RTO markets that I just mentioned. And about 30 states have renewable portfolio standards that require utilities to procure renewable energy. There are other policies, such as New York's Clean Energy Standard and Massachusetts' recent energy legislation, that favor particular sources of power, particular types of sources. And such policies have existed alongside FERC's markets, but due to a number of factors, market participants have been asking FERC and courts to preempt those policies or to change market rules so they explicitly accommodate those policies. The recent Supreme Court case, Hughes v. Talon, decided in April, is an example of one of those cases. So FERC's going to be asked to deal with these policies, whether through complaints filed by market participants or rule changes filed by RTO market operators. FERC may be asked to weigh in at federal court, as FERC did at Hughes, or FERC could potentially be proactive and itself decide to reform market rules to account for these state policies. The second decision point is about distributed energy resources. Compensation for distributed energy resources, particularly rooftop solar, is an issue that's being discussed at state public utility commissions across the country. FERC has explicitly decided not to assert jurisdiction over net metering, as an example, and a decision that it reaffirmed in 2009. But as distributed energy resources continue to grow, this is an issue that has recently returned to FERC and will likely return again. The third decision point is about PURPA. That's a law passed by Congress in 1978 to spur the development of renewables and cogeneration. FERC held a technical conference on PURPA rules in June. These technical conferences can be a precursor to a FERC rulemaking, but that's certainly not always the case. There have been several PURPA-related complaints filed at FERC and in federal courts. We highlight a few of these at a website we have called statepowerproject.org. Some of these complaints are filed by developers who feel that PURPA provides insufficient compensation, but also states and utilities have expressed dissatisfaction with PURPA, particularly in the West, and feel that the PURPA rules are too generous and they force vertically integrated utilities to buy energy that they don't need. FERC may continue to deal with PURPA on a case-by-case basis as it does now, or it may be getting ready to issue new rules. And the final issue that we highlight is about mergers. We've seen continued consolidation in both the gas and electric industries, which are both regulated by FERC. At the same time, there have been concerns raised that utilities may be acting anti-competitively in some of the debates around distributed energy resources. FERC recently issued a notice of inquiry on how it analyzes mergers and other transactions. The scope of this initial inquiry seems somewhat narrow given the big picture issues I just raised, but this is certainly an issue that will be worth watching. And with that, I will turn it over to Christina Reichert to discuss the climate issue.
Thanks, Ari. So the next topic we covered in our paper was climate policy. Regardless of the next administration's viewpoint on climate, the next president will be faced with decisions under existing federal laws and international commitments. First, related to appointments, the next president will appoint the heads of the next Environmental Protection Agency, U.S. Department of Energy, and the White House's Office of Management and Budget. The current federal approach to regulating greenhouse gases began with Massachusetts v. EPA, where the Supreme Court found that greenhouse gases are pollutants subject to regulation under the Clean Air Act. This decision required the EPA to determine if greenhouse gases endanger public health and welfare, and after making that determination, EPA created actions limiting greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles and certain new and modified power plants and industrial facilities. The EPA's Clean Power Plan was another significant step under this approach, and the next administration will be faced with decision points related to the litigation surrounding this rule, specifically whether to request review of any part of the D.C. Circuit Court's opinion. States and environmental interveners could also independently seek this review. This decision will turn on the Court's reasoning and final opinion, the likely makeup of the Supreme Court by the time it would hear the case, and the next president's perspective on climate change and the merits of using the Clean Air Act to impose emissions limits. This rule also potentially represents the first step in a sector-by-sector approach to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The next EPA could decide to continue this process, or environmental and public health groups may petition the agencies to create regulations for new and existing sources from other sectors under Section 111D of the Clean Air Act. Thus, either by choice or in response to these petitions, the next president may face questions of whether and how to proceed with respect to these other sectors. These decision points include which sector to address first, which depends on the sector's emissions reduction opportunities, and economic sensitivity to regulation, and how to regulate those sectors, either using technology control options or, for example, using market-based approaches such as those in the Clean Power Plan. In addition to domestic laws, the President will face decision points that have implications on foreign relations, such as compliance with the United States commitment in the Paris Accord and future international climate action. The Clean Power Plan is projected to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by about 740 million metric tons, which is equal to about 43% of the U.S. Paris commitment to reduce economy-wide emissions by 26 to 28% from 2005 levels by 2050. However, existing regulation may not be sufficient to meet this whole commitment. Thus, in addition to domestic pressures, the next administration may face international pressure to require further greenhouse gas emission reductions. And the next president may be pressured to develop a 2030 goal for reductions. In addition to decision points regarding reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the next administration may need to decide whether and how agencies incorporate the social cost of carbon into their rulemaking decisions. Inclusion of this metric in agency analyses began after a Ninth Circuit decision that found a National Highway Transportation Safety Administration action was arbitrary and capricious for failing to monetize the value of carbon emissions reductions when setting vehicle emission standards. After different agencies independently developed different estimates of this value, an interagency working group was formed to improve consistency. In 2010, this working group selected 4 values for use in regulatory analyses and updated them in 2013. Recently, the Seventh Circuit upheld the U.S. Department of Energy's use of the social cost of carbon in its analysis of energy efficiency standards for commercial refrigeration equipment. Given the Ninth Circuit and Seventh Circuit precedents, agencies that do not include a social cost of carbon in their analyses risk legal challenge. The next administration could choose to take this risk and not include the value of carbon emissions reductions in agency analyses. Or it may adjust how the cost is calculated, such as limiting the analysis to domestic costs rather than global costs. Now I'll turn it over to my colleague Sarah Adair, also from the Nicholas Institute.
Thanks, Christina. So as we look forward to the next administration, nuclear energy is another area where decisions by the next president will affect the long-term trajectory of the electricity sector and the generation mix going forward. In our report, we identify 4 decision points the next administration will face with respect to nuclear energy. In the interest of time, I'm going to focus my comments on the first 2, retirements and relicensing of existing units. So first, retirement. As Jonas mentioned in his introductory remarks, some nuclear power plants operating in FERC-regulated regional transmission organizations are facing economic headwinds due to low wholesale prices for energy. 4 nuclear power plants have retired since 2013, another 5 have announced plans to retire by 2019, and still more could be at risk of retirement. While economics are not the only factor in these retirements that we've seen so far, a number of these plants are located in RTO regions and are facing low wholesale power prices. For example, according to the Energy Information Administration, wholesale power prices were down between 27 and 37% across the nation in 2015 compared with 2014. And most of that reduction, according to EIA, was attributable to low natural gas prices, a trend that we expect will continue. This recent wave of retirements and the possibility of additional retirements absent policy intervention has prompted discussions at the state level and factored into conversations within RTOs about prices and performance. The most notable of these discussions around price supports for existing nuclear is, of course, New York's recently adopted Clean Energy Standard, which requires distribution utilities to purchase zero-emission credits from existing nuclear plants. So what does all this mean for the next administration? Thinking back to Ari's discussion of FERC's role in federal regulation of energy markets, we see potentially a role for FERC here. So FERC may be asked to weigh in on claims filed in state or federal court challenging state policies, such as very likely challenges to New York's policy, or potentially if FERC wanted to, the Commission could act on its own to require RTOs to change market rules, which would be a break from its historical posture of not embracing particular generation sources. So that's decision point 1 for nuclear energy. I want to turn next to relicensing. Again, as many of you know, the 60th birthdays of existing plants are starting to show up in long-term planning horizons. Those 60th birthdays represent the end of current operating licenses for most plants that are operating today. The NRC grants initial operating licenses for 40 years and then has authority under existing law to extend existing operating licenses for existing plants for periods of up to 20 years at a time. So with the 60th birthday showing up in the planning horizons, utilities are starting to plan for whether those plants will continue to operate. For example, Dominion Virginia Power has announced that they will apply for a second license extension for one of their plants in 2019. Dominion looks like they'll be the first, and that application, of course, is likely to come during the next administration. So the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is in the process of preparing to review the first applications to grant existing units license to operate beyond 60 years. The existing legal framework would allow for such licenses, as I noted. Research by the Electric Power Research Institute and the Department of Energy on the long-term operation of nuclear plants also indicates that there aren't any generic technical barriers to operating plants from 60 to 80 years. So these are likely to be case-by-case decisions. However, the specific requirements and therefore the cost for obtaining those second operating license extensions haven't been finalized yet, and the NRC does not have plans to finalize them or guidance regarding those applications until next summer. So the next administration will inherit that unfinalized guidance and could choose either to finalize it as planned or change course, making it either harder or easier to relicense existing units. If existing units are not relicensed, we could see a fairly dramatic fall off in nuclear power beginning in the 2030 to 2035 timeframe, assuming those units are not replaced with new nuclear. Speaking of new nuclear, the third decision point we identify related to nuclear energy in our report pertains to near-term decisions about the licensing of new technologies, small modular reactors in the immediate future and advanced non-light water reactors a little farther down the line. And our final decision point on nuclear energy pertains to the long-term storage of waste. So here we note that the next administration will need to decide how to move forward given the Obama administration's declaration that Yucca Mountain is unworkable and their attempt to move to a consent-based siting process, which would require new legislative authority to implement. You can read more about those in the report, but before I turn it over to Kate, I want to note that the next president's greatest influence, as Ari mentioned in the case of FERC, over the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is through the appointment of commissioners, which must be approved by the Senate. All three current members of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission will reach the end of their current term during the next administration in June 2017, 18, and 2019, respectively. There are also 2 current vacancies on the commission, and the next president might appoint members to those vacancies if they're not filled before the next president takes office. And with that, I will turn it over to Kate to talk about natural gas.
Thanks, Sarah. The picture of natural gas in the United States has really changed dramatically in the last 10 years. I'll just note two trends here to provide context for the decisions facing the next administration. First, dry natural gas reserves in the United States have grown. From 2000 to 2010, estimates of technically recoverable reserves jumped about 40%. We've also seen a really big jump up in production. As you can see in the graph, the EIA projects under these scenarios at least double the natural gas production in 2040 over 1990 levels. This is particularly remarkable given price spikes in the mid-2000s amid concerns that our conventional reserves were drying up. Second, while we're seeing a drop in conventional supplies, tight gas and shale gas production are more than making up for this shortfall. Shale gas represented about 5% in total dry gas production in 2004, 10% in 2007, and 56% of overall production in 2015. This is the foreseeable future of natural gas in the United States. Next slide, please. These trends influence the decision points in this issue area. The decision points fall into three buckets: climate policy, supply-side regulation, and natural gas infrastructure and other impacts on demand. First, climate policy, and particularly in the electricity sector. As Jonas pointed out at the start of this webinar, cheap natural gas has given coal a run for its money in the wholesale electricity markets. In SEC filings, we're seeing electric utilities pointing to low natural gas prices as a reason for coal retirements, for instance, the Big Brown plant in Texas. Natural gas-fired power plants also hold an advantage in a pollution-constrained operating environment. Gas plants emit a fraction of the nitrogen oxides and sulfur dioxides and less than half of the carbon dioxide of coal plants when generating the same amount of electricity. Christina talked about the Clean Power Plan. That plan set carbon reduction targets for the power sector based explicitly in part on our ability to shift production from coal to natural gas generation. If the rule survives legal challenge, it would reinforce a competitive advantage for natural gas in the near term. The decisions the next president will face on the Clean Power Plan, which Christina just discussed, could influence the role that natural gas plays in federal climate policy. Similarly, whether the next administration decides to champion or abandon the production tax credit for renewable energy could affect demand for natural gas to the extent gas plants are used to back up intermittent generators like wind and solar. Second, supply-side regulation. Federal regulation can affect natural gas supplies by preventing development in certain areas or making it more or less expensive to produce natural gas. We've had robust debate in this country over regulation of shale gas development, focusing on the high-volume hydraulic fracturing as a new and somewhat different stage in natural gas production. We've also faced new challenges posed by higher volume plays and plays where dewatering is necessary, such as the induced seismicity we've seen in the central part of the United States. The federal government is by no means the only or even the most important regulator in this space, but the decisions the next administration will take could still loom large for natural gas production, particularly given the really low gas prices and low profit margins on wells right now. In addition, the Bureau of Land Management oversees 758 million acres of subsurface mineral estate, and as a landowner, the federal government faces a special set of issues about whether and how to allow natural gas production. The next administration will inherit lawsuits relating to supply-side management. For instance, BLM's rule to regulate hydraulic fracturing on federal and tribal lands was challenged and is pending in the 10th Circuit. Meanwhile, environmental groups have sued EPA to reconsider its exemption of oil and gas E&P waste from federal hazardous waste laws. The next administration may face additional lawsuits if the BLM finalizes a rule before January to limit methane emissions from federal land production, or if environmental groups sue based on pending petitions with EPA seeking regulation under the Safe Drinking Water Act. EPA has promulgated rules to address methane emissions from new oil and gas infrastructure and is collecting information to inform an existing source rule. The next administration may choose to proceed with this rulemaking or to stand down. The next administration might also take steps to incorporate induced seismicity prevention provisions into Class 2 well regulations, which would align those regulations with the Class 6 rules. The third set of decision points relate to natural gas infrastructure and other demand-side actions. Federal policies can drive or reduce demand for natural gas in the electricity and other sectors. One of the areas where the federal government has particularly strong control is over the construction of infrastructure for interstate transport or the export of natural gas. FERC licenses liquid natural gas, or LNG, export terminals, which could open international markets to U.S. shale gas producers. New FERC appointees may have to rule on the several pending terminal permit applications. Now, some environmental groups have been challenging these approvals for failure to consider greenhouse gas emissions associated with the combustion of the exported gas. But in July 2016, the D.C. Circuit upheld FERC's decision not to count for those emissions. Groups have also challenged the DOE's general approval of exports. These battles might grow in importance or fade as demand for export terminals slows while natural gas prices remain depressed. FERC also approves interstate pipelines and grants eminent domain authority to natural gas pipeline companies. Groups are challenging these decisions on the grounds that FERC has failed to consider environmental impacts. If they are successful, FERC may be driven to attach conditions to approvals as a matter of course. There are other ways to affect demand for natural gas held by the administration. They could introduce it on the Hill energy packages that include incentives for CNG or electric vehicles. DOE R&D programs might drive innovation in natural gas fuel cells. Tax credits might reward new end uses for natural gas or petrochemical production. Alternatively, the federal government might structure incentives and R&D programs to leapfrog natural gas as a combustion fuel and to rely more heavily on demand response, storage, advanced nuclear, or renewable energy to meet our energy needs. Across these three issue areas, government action will combine with commodity prices and technology to shape the future of natural gas. And now I'll turn things over to Jonas again, this time to discuss economic development.
Great. Thanks, Kate. So the changes that Ari, Sarah, Christina, and Kate have discussed so far are all having direct impacts on employment in many parts of the country. We've seen job growth related to renewable energy. Low natural gas prices are contributing to job growth in some manufacturing sectors. Job growth in oil and gas extraction has expanded and contracted in some parts of the country just in a relatively short period of time. All these changes are also having a major impact on communities dependent on coal-related jobs. The job losses are not new for the coal mining sector. The sector has seen consistently falling employment numbers since the 1980s. But the pace of the current electricity sector transition is exacerbating the employment impacts on the mining sector, and it's also impacting communities that are seeing retirements of coal-fired power plants in their local areas, and communities that are dependent on jobs related to coal transport. The Obama administration has responded to these changes by creating the Partnerships for Opportunity and Workforce and Economic Revitalization Initiative. That's a mouthful. The shorthand is the POWER Initiative. It's a multi-agency program that draws upon resources from numerous existing economic development and workforce development programs from the Department of Labor, the Appalachian Regional Council, the Department of Commerce, the EPA's Brownfields Development Program, and the Department of Agriculture. The programs and the POWER Initiative itself primarily provides grants to states, local governments, tribes, and nonprofit organizations focusing on job retraining and other economic development programs. The Obama administration's fiscal year 2017 budget also includes provisions to support healthcare and pension plans for retired coal miners and their families, reclaiming abandoned mines, deploying carbon capture, storage, and reutilization technologies. And the next president will determine whether and how to deploy these existing economic development programs to address changes in the energy sector and how much to focus specifically on changes in communities that are dependent on coal-related jobs. If Congress does allocate the specific funds that the Obama administration has requested for the upcoming fiscal year, the next president will also focus on how to deploy those new resources. And the House and Senate versions of the energy bill also include economic development provisions. The Senate's version includes 3 programs. One, creating a 21st Century Workforce Advisory Board to focus on meeting current and future energy sector needs and also developing a skilled workforce to do so. Providing competitive grants for job training programs, and creating grants to train and certify students for the installation of energy-efficient building technologies. The House version doesn't create new funding initiatives, but it does specify that energy and manufacturing job training is a priority for the nation and establishes a Department of Energy clearinghouse to disseminate information about existing workforce development programs. If the energy bill does pass, if any of these provisions are included in the final version, then the next administration will also determine how to implement these new programs. So with that, let me turn it back to Ari for our final topic that we cover, and then we will move to questions.
All right, thanks, Jonas. The final topic is federal government procurement. So this is about the federal government not as a regulator, as we've talked about in some of the earlier topics, but the federal government as a market participant here. And it's a big one. The federal government is responsible for more than 1% of the nation's electric bill, and it operates the largest vehicle fleet in the country. So its procurement decisions can actually really have an effect. In 2005, Congress required agencies, federal agencies, to reduce building energy consumption 20% by 2015, and 2 years later in 2007, Congress increased that target to 30%. And Congress also tasked DOE with renewable energy procurement, that is seeking to ensure to the extent economically feasible and technically practicable that at least 7.5% of energy purchased by the federal government come from renewable sources. And in 2015, the Obama administration issued Executive Order 13693, which goes above and beyond those goals in terms of renewable energy procurement and efficiency. So the key decision for the next administration will be whether or not to move forward with Obama's goals or to retreat to the goals established by Congress. So for those of you that had Executive Order 13693 on your debate bingo cards, you've been very disappointed with the first 2 debates. But I have my fingers crossed that Chris Wallace asks a question next week about EO 13693. The second decision point up here is about accounting for greenhouse gas emissions in federal government procurements. And there's a proposed rule that was issued in May that could serve as a basis for accounting for emissions from contractors, but it doesn't go nearly that far. All the rule would do, if finalized, would require contractors with that sort of sell above, I believe, $7.5 million to the federal government to report whether or not they already report their greenhouse gas emissions and then where they do so. So if the Obama administration were to finalize this rule, which could certainly happen in the next few months, the decision point for the next administration would then be what you do with this data, if anything. And of course, if the Obama administration does not finalize this, then the next administration will make that determination about whether or not to finalize the rule. And the third decision point here is about electric vehicles. That Executive Order 13693 requires that 50% of new agency passenger vehicles be zero emission or plug-in hybrid by 2025, and it also requires reductions in per mile greenhouse gas emissions. The FAST Act, which was passed by Congress at the end of 2015, authorizes the General Services Administration to install electric vehicle chargers at government facilities. So installation of those chargers, now authorized by law, could help facilitate increased procurement of electric vehicles. And then a final thing to mention here is the Volkswagen settlement. That's about the Volkswagen emission scandal, and that's currently before a federal court. But if the federal court approves the settlement, it would require VW to spend $2 billion on electric vehicle infrastructure. That could potentially help the government meet its goal, but it depends on how that money is spent, which remains to be seen. So with that, I will close up our presentation, and now we'll open it up for questions.